Are you a foreign company with employees working in Sweden?
Or are you sending employees to Sweden to work for a customer of yours?
Or perhaps you're sending employees to a group company in Sweden?
We spend our days helping companies and their employees understanding the rules and obligations and to set up and execute effective structures for their cross-border employees. And in this video, we'll give you a brief introduction to what you need to consider as a foreign company with people on the ground in Sweden, and a few tips for the road.
Sweden is a country of opportunities for both business and people. Apart from our high ranking on the Forbes annual list of the best countries for business, Sweden is a diverse country that offers high standard of living and extensive welfare benefits.
However, as a foreign company with people on the ground in Sweden, rules around tax, social security, and employer reporting obligations have grown more and more complex over time, and they can be difficult to navigate. And this is why now more than ever, a well thought out approach is recommended to ensure compliance and to get a good understanding of the costs associated with your operations in Sweden. My name is Agnes, and I work as an advisor within global mobility at Skeppsbron Skatt, where we help companies with tax and social security questions related to moving people cross-border.
And my name is Fanny, and I specialize in expatriate payroll and global compensation management at Aspia, specifically working with payroll management and reporting obligations for foreign companies in Sweden. So much of the complexity for foreign employers is tied to the tax liability of their employees. As you mentioned, the rules in Sweden have become increasingly complex. Can you tell us more about this?
Yes, so what I'm mostly referring to is a recent change in the application of a tax exemption rule for temporary work in Sweden. And this is a rule that applies to foreign employees with a foreign employer. And by temporary, we mean no more than 183 days per year. Now, from 2021, the rule does not apply to employees that are considered being hired out to work on behalf of a Swedish entity, for example, a group company or a Swedish customer, and this is what is often referred to as an economic employer concept. So if there's an economic employer in Sweden, there's no tax exemption. And whether a person is considered being hired out in relation to this rule is a case-by-case assessment.
But there is an exception for shorter business trips.
That's correct. So there is an exception for very limited work in Sweden. So if you have an employee with no prior connection to Sweden and who's only here for work a few days per year, you can assume that there should be no tax implications, provided that all other conditions are met, of course. So for example, there cannot be a Swedish permanent establishment to apply this rule. But it's not only the employees' tax obligations that have changed, but more foreign companies now have reporting obligations in Sweden, don't they?
Yes. So even if there is an economic employer in Sweden, the reporting obligations are still connected to the payer of the salary. And if the employee cannot use the tax exemption rule, the foreign company will be obligated to register as an employer and make wage tax withholdings in Sweden on a monthly basis, even if there's no permanent establishment or a Swedish entity. An important takeaway is that foreign companies without a permanent establishment in Sweden may have similar obligations connected to employer reporting as Swedish companies, and the reporting obligation is connected to the tax liability and social security affiliation of their employees. And remember, you may need a business registration if you invoice a Swedish company for work performed in Sweden. Otherwise, your customer may need to withhold tax from the invoice amount.
Yes, and that's a very important takeaway. And together with these registrations that Fanny was talking about, the Swedish tax agency will assess whether there is a permanent establishment in Sweden or not at that time. And this is also the most crucial assessment for the level of reporting obligations. Not to mention that you may be obligated to provide information to the tax agency about your activities in Sweden on an annual basis. So the exposure has really increased as well. And this is why we do recommend a review of the company's expected tax liability in Sweden in connection to filing any registration.
Yes, and then you need to assess the tax liability and social security affiliation of your employees. These assessments are necessary to determine your reporting obligation as an employer. And when taking on a new client with personnel in Sweden, these are the first thing we ask for or assist with at Aspia and Skeppsbron Skatt. You may also need to register the posting with the Swedish Work Environment Agency and/or follow the same regulations as Swedish companies related to, for example, labor law.
Exactly, and this is why we work together with labor law experts on many of our clients. So the tax liability of your employees is a key factor to determine the reporting obligations. But you also mentioned Social Security, which has a major impact as well. So from an international standpoint, Swedish Social Security charges are famously high, and the employer is responsible for the contributions.
So how should a company know if their employees are covered by the Swedish Social Security or not?
Well, a person who's locally employed in Sweden is generally affiliated to Swedish Social Security. But for secondments to Sweden, there are exceptions. But it also depends on the countries that are involved in the cross-border situation. So, for example, there is an EU regulation that settles to which country's social security system a person should be affiliated. We have also entered social security conventions with a few other countries that may need to be considered. And this too needs to be managed through the payroll reporting, correct, Fanny?
Yes. So if your employers are covered by the Swedish Social Security, you need to register as an employer and report contributions on a monthly basis.
So if we establish that there is an employee reporting obligation, what do I need to do and how does that work?
So we recommend firstly making sure that the employer registration is in place. And thereafter, before your employees start working, to have all the necessary decisions in place to make sure that the wage tax withholdings are correct from the start. The processing time with the tax agency may vary throughout the year and depending on the type of application. But please keep in mind that this requires a large measure of proactivity for the company planning to have employees in Sweden. The next practical step is then to set up a payroll. You must consider that you are obligated to comply with the Swedish rules regarding, for example, working hours, vacation and parental leave, which should be factored into the payroll. The payroll is run monthly and translates into a reporting through a pay return, which is submitted to the tax agency. And once filed, a payment of the taxes and social security contributions is made to the tax agency. It can sound expensive and complicated to have employees working in Sweden, but there is a possibility to some relief.
Yes, actually there is a possibility for foreign employees with a Swedish employer to be comprised by expert tax relief in Sweden, which means that 25% of the income is exempt from both tax and social security contributions for a period of up to 5 years. So there are some savings to be made there for both the employer and the employee. However, there are some common pitfalls that can have a huge impact if missed. So for instance, there's a hard deadline for the application, which is 3 months from the start of work in Sweden. So what happens if the employer do not fulfill their reporting obligations?
So if you do not comply with the reporting obligations as employer in Sweden, you risk penalties and fees for delayed reporting or failure to report. There's also a risk if you do not comply once registered, that the tax agency decides to deregister the company as business and employer in Sweden. It's also always recommended to do right from the start. It's both time-consuming and expensive to perform retroactive reporting, both based on the administration, but also based on the interest cost and fees associated with this. There might also be some other things to consider here.
Yes, there are. So apart from the direct financial risks, as an employer, it's of course important to look after your employees and incentivize going on an assignment or taking up employment in Sweden. And other than potential penalties for their own non-compliance, they may have some questions. So what will be my net salary when I'm working and paying tax in Sweden? And if my net in pocket will be substantially lower, or if I don't know what will happen, I might be reluctant to go or become very dissatisfied later when it turns out that I'm now worse off than when I was working back home. Then there are questions about practicalities. So should I file a Swedish tax return? How do I do that? Are there any deductions I can use? And I'm being taxed in both Sweden and my home country. How do I solve that? And if there are uncertainties, that often comes back to you as an employer. Then we may also have other commercial risks to consider, such as negative exposure or customer requirements even. So even if you as a company don't expect any major risks related to non-compliance, we do see an increased tendency for Swedish clients to request that their subcontractors have their house in order. And perhaps you need to fulfill some minimum demands to even be considered in procurements. Now, the rules may seem complicated, but it is important to remember that it's not an impossible task and it can work well with a good process in place. So then the question becomes, how do you make that happen?
Of course, there's a major difference between a one-off business trip and sending multiple employees to Sweden. But if you do expect to have a group of people on the ground here, it's recommended to plan ahead and take ownership of the challenges that comes with being a global employer. Oftentimes, we see these questions about cross-border employees sort of being shuffled around, and no one really has the full picture or has time set aside to handle this.
Yes, and then it becomes more a question of putting out fires, and that's not the best or cheapest approach to deal with this. So that is the first task. Who is responsible for questions related to cross-border personnel within your organization? And the second action point is to create awareness within the organization that this is in fact an important question when you venture into Sweden with your employees. And this is where we hope this video will contribute. Then you should map out the risks and opportunities and assess your options for an effective setup and an effective compensation package, and from there agree on a joint policy. So that way everyone knows what applies and you can get a more streamlined management. And then to implement this, it's important to have an internal process in place. So in essence, who should have what information, at what time, and what should they do with the information? Then this needs to be spread within the organization, and communication is absolutely key in this respect. Then you need to think about what level of support you want to offer your employees. So as I mentioned, your employees may have questions and you may need to think about how to handle this. So what level do you want to offer? Should you offer individual assistance or group trainings? What works best for you to give the employees the appropriate guidance?
It can be a bit tricky when you're not comfortable with the local regulations. We have a lot of experience with companies coming to us after a few years needing advice or assistance with correcting the past. Most of the information is available on the World Wide Web. However, we strongly recommend foreign companies to seek advice, as it's not always easy to identify the exact needs for your company on your own. You may miss important requirements because you don't know what to look for or what questions to ask.
Yes, and we can be your speaking partner and provide concrete advice and support regarding your cross-border employees. We can also help you to map out an effective setup and support you in the implementation and execution, as well as provide support to your employees.
Having foreign employees in Sweden can be compliance heavy, and we can help you with your registration, any application, and running the expatriate payroll in Sweden.
And together, Skeppsbron Skatt and Aspia offer full coordination between the tax and the payroll team, and through our network, we can provide global support. If you have or is considering having employees in Sweden, please reach out to us for an initial meeting free of charge. Thank you for listening, and best of luck with your business in Sweden.
We hope to see you soon.